All right, welcome to day two of the Smart Protein Summit 2021. We're delighted to have you here. As we've been discussing through many years and on day one of the Smart Protein Summit, we've seen a huge amount of progress, particularly in plant-based foods. Yesterday on day one, we discussed with many entrepreneurs as well as corporations what's going on in the state of the industry and what needs to happen to take it to the next level in terms of touching more consumers, distributing to every corner of the country as well as the planet, really, and then really making sure that India is on the map in the smart protein sector. On day two, we have a very exciting day laid out for you that's focused on laying that roadmap for the future. And at this juncture in the industry, there's a huge amount of opportunity, but also many challenges that remain to get out to mega scale. So if we're going to address our challenges over the next decade of public and planetary health, and we feel that smart protein is a key piece of addressing those challenges, we really need to think about that mega scale. And our keynote speaker today is very well placed to do that from a storied career in the corporate realm. We're very excited to welcome Mr. Siraj Chaudhry, who is MD and CEO at National Commodities Management Services Limited, and he's former chairman at Cargill India, among a number of other honors in a very storied corporate career. He's led and steered transformations at mega companies over decades in food and agriculture. For example, he built Cargill India's food foray to really $1 billion business from nearly scratch. And he's been widely lauded for his stellar leadership in edible oil fortification, which improves the nutritional status of millions. That was also recognized as a Change the World initiative by Fortune magazine. Siraj continues to sit on the board of mega food companies like Tata Consumer Products, Tata Coffee, and Jubilant Ingrevia Limited, all of these corporations that influence the lives of hundreds of millions across the country. So safe to say he knows a thing or two about scaling up, which is exactly what we need in our sector. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over to Siraj and say hello. Hi, Siraj. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Varun. Pleasure to be here at this very interesting summit. I mean, this is a subject which is gaining a lot of traction around the world, and I'm glad that we're having a conversation around that.
Yeah, Siraj, and I will say, I mean, we have come a long way, right, in smart protein. I think the fact that people like yourself are setting up and taking notice, at least as something that's interesting, is a mark of how far we've come. Now, you've had a very wide vantage point as a corporate executive, a board member across supply chain, logistics, FMCG. Now, all protein and particularly plant-based foods, as I said, are taking off globally. They're being supported by major food and beverage giants like Cargill as a key piece of their growth goals. But what is it that's making you sit up and take notice? What excites you personally about this sector?
So, Varun, I've stepped back into history, and as I was thinking through this, at different points in human evolution, certain things have been taken for granted as saying, okay, this is the normal. And then you have had more science and more education coming in to say, no, it is not the normal, and we need to find the next normal. And so it actually started with a conversation around smoking. Many decades ago, hundreds of years ago, smoking tobacco was an indulgence of the rich and the well-to-do people, and was a symbol of, high society to a certain extent, till science discovered that this was not what mankind or humankind needed to do. And obviously, today, the world takes a very different view of it. Similarly with sugar, when sugar was in its current refined form was discovered, it was like God's gift to mankind, and everyone sort of went for it. But gradually, people realize, and now as science is coming out to say that, okay, how does it affect human health? And there's a different view emerging on it. Similarly, with meats, there is a view that this is how humankind fed itself down the ages, and therefore this is the normal. But now, with greater concern on environment, with food, with diseases, with science, there is a realization, no, this is not necessarily a normal. But bear in mind that all these change, and there are many such. I mean, it's with fat, it's with salt. I mean, we're seeing a lot of these discoveries happening where things that have been taken for granted as the normal, the foods that we've grown up with, the foods that history's talked about, the desi ghee versus conversion to refined oils. I mean, those are all examples of where human beings have had to revisit their normal to establish a new normal. So this is, I think, a beginning of a new, search for a new normal changing what has been considered the normal. Now, different geographies obviously have had different consumption patterns of meat, and therefore why this change is needed is being explained in different ways in different locations. So it has a number of sort of points which come together. So there's a conversation around ethical treatment of animals. There is a point around planet. There is a sort of conversation around water usage and the depleting water resources. Then there is about the whole thing about health reasons. And so different countries are taking different positions on why this move is important. If I look at India, I would say that a lot of reasons which are applicable to the rest of the world are not necessarily going to be in practice here, or should be the drivers here. We are not a predominantly meat-eating country. I mean, we are a severely protein deficient country. So our opportunity is that, okay, as we beef up is the wrong word here, but as we grow our protein consumption, we have an opportunity to set a different path to it than what the rest of the world has done. And therefore, this conversation at this point of time actually fits in, because we're not talking about what we should be doing today or tomorrow, but we're actually having a conversation about setting a base for what it should be 30 years, 50 years, 100 years down the line.
Yeah, I love the long view. I think at GFI India and in this sector, we have to take a long view. A lot of what we are talking about is exactly as you described, Siraj. It's almost a leapfrog opportunity. If we're not eating that much meat today, can we get to the point where we are at least providing a viable alternative, right? So that we can actually leapfrog to that alternative and provide that tasty, affordable, sustainable protein at scale to address those problems you mentioned without all the damage to the planet, right? But I think ultimately success will rest on things like taste, cost, scale, distribution. And you know this much better than anyone, really. I mean, this is more critical in a market like India, where the true mass market will turn on these factors. So what would you say is the playbook for a fledgling sector that's just really getting started with a very immature supply chain to go to the true mass market from your experience?
So yeah, you're right. This is something which will have to fit itself in. Experiments on trying to change the diets or change the tastes haven't really worked. I mean, there have been examples of breakfast cereals trying to replace, the conventional Indian breakfast, and what we ultimately ended up with those companies actually including the Indian variants into their product mixes. Similarly, the lot of conversation around sugar being replaced by natural sweeteners. And there again, the taste is probably acting as a barrier, because it's a no-brainer to say that, okay, if you can replace a sugar versus a non-sugar, given India's diabetic proposition, it should be a no-brainer to say that, okay, we go. But taste is becoming a barrier there too. So taste is going to be an important consideration. The other is that, we say India is a vegetarian country because of our religious considerations, but the reality is that it is also a vegetarian country because of our economic considerations. I mean, if we look at the diet pyramids, people move to proteins from carbohydrates only with economic growth, and that is something that we have. And a live example of that is China. I mean, whose protein consumption? I mean, I sometimes thank God that we are a large vegetarian country, because if India was to start consuming meat as China was, then we would have been in a very difficult situation. So the affordability and accessibility, affordability, and taste, not necessarily in that order, are going to be critical drivers for people to be taking. And I'm not using the word switching to this, because this is not about saying that meat or this. In India, it has to be meat and this. And that is where, from looking at the marketplace, it is not about telling consumers that meat is bad, because if you go through an ICMR recommended diet, which says that Indians should be having 10 kilos per capita meat consumption, poultry consumption, which today is about 3.5, there's a huge gap. So you're not trying to say that, okay, replace that 3.5 with this. You're saying that, okay, 10 minus 3.5 is the space that we have to fit something else. But that something else has to match the taste of what the consumer wants, and also the price, because that is something which will drive how people consume. And I will stop here at the moment because, I'd rather have your next question.
Got it. Yeah, Siraj. And I think that's a very interesting point. I mean, a lot of what's happening now around the world is that alternative proteins or smart protein it's an either or. Sorry, excuse me, it's an and rather than an either or, right? Many countries are seeing that as a way of plugging the gap in protein supply in ways that don't continue to have huge burdens on planetary health, etc. But you were talking about 3.5 going up to 10. That's still a huge gap, right? And let's stay with supply chain and logistics here. I mean, people often say, let's say it's difficult to build a cold chain. A lot of the products in the plant-based meat space are chilled or frozen because that's how people are used to buying their meat products, right? So it's something that they really want their meat products to be chilled or frozen, right? And therefore, that's something that they're looking at. Chilled maybe more than frozen. But we've also heard that if consumer demand exists for a certain category, cold chain can be built over time. So we've seen it, for example, with ice cream, right? We've seen it with companies like Licious, who are growing very rapidly in the conventional meat landscape, Licious, Fresh to Home, etc., investing hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Thousands of crores in building that cold chain and that supply chain. Even here in India, in the plant-based meat space, across the socioeconomic pyramid, people are telling us, if you build it, we will come. The demand exists for products that taste the same as meat, which might be made from plant-based sources or otherwise. So kind of where's the disconnect here? How will it, how do we go from where we are now, as we were discussing yesterday, lots of exciting launches, but really mostly focused on urban top end of the market. How do we go from where we are now to having access to this huge scale, getting out to the rest of the country at the right price, like you mentioned?
So this is, the kind of investments that are coming in are needed for this kind of an approach, for the simple reason that, this is a long gestation activity. This will need risk capital, which is patient, because you're building a long, and, a lot of companies in the past have looked at the Indian meat market and realized that, it is not like the world market. It is a wet market. People still want to go and buy their meat fresh. And what companies like, and that was the reason which deterred large corporations to come into this space, because, this market was not organized. What the companies which are now coming in with the delivery mechanism have leveraged technology to challenge that which doesn't say that you have to have these stores or whatever. People want to eat what they want to eat, and they can get it in the comfort of their home, because while wet market was a desire, it was the most inconvenient thing for a lot of people, particularly the urban dwellers. I mean, I've grown up in an environment where there used to be the weekly markets where twice a week meat would be cut and sold in a small town, and people would wait for 2 days, those 2 days in the week, to go and buy their meat. That today has, or is changing, and that supply chain is equally applicable to the alternate protein. But that is not the alternate protein that I want to be talking about, because that's a very restricted market piece. When I look at alternate protein for India, I see it as the need of the country, for the simple reason that we are a 70% protein deficient country. And this source of protein can be less impacting. And India is also a water deficit country. And so we have to put various sort of combinations together to say that how do we get this protein to the masses, and which will require a lot of research and development in food technology, in preserving it, and then going and distributing it. So and that's why the whole thing is that it has to be and with other things. It is about using these proteins to perform some of the everyday, activities. It's not going to be that someone wants to buy chicken legs, will go and buy alternate protein. This alternate protein has to come as, and the reason, I mean, I've had a number of conversations around this, which is that people who are vegetarians, by religion or how they have lived their lives, are not certainly going to start eating products which look or taste like meat, because that's not a taste that they have been missing in their lives, right? I mean, they have created their own taste buds, their own cuisines, which are working fine for them. So this has to fit in as, I was trying to think, what can this fit into, right? So this could be part of your samosas, ingredients into your dosas, so the Indian cuisines have to be, or the recipes have to be created for traditional Indian cuisines with this in it. And it is not like this being an outsider. The effort has to be made to make this an insider. The selling has to be taste, but for a larger population, it is also about health. At one level, we have a population which is worried about health from an obesity perspective. There is a large population which is worried about health from a nutrition perspective. This actually serves both the segments, and that is the opportunity here. But making it palatable and making it affordable is going to be critical. India has a history of producing pulses. There's a whole lot of the whole world is trying to produce pulses for India. We've talked about pea protein. So there are ingredients which are within our grasp. So it is not as if we have to do. When we talk about alternate protein in the Western world, there is this whole need for cultivated meat, the bioreactors, the whole large space thing. I guess we are not talking about cultivated meat in India. We're talking more about the veg protein meat or alternate meat from there. Or I won't use the word meat. I would say an alternate source of protein, which can serve the need which meats are serving today. And I think that is where the opportunity lies to address both the segments of Indian population.
Yeah, makes complete sense. I think, and we get this question all the time, as you hit the nail on the head. Who is this for? If it's going to be something that bleeds like meat and sizzles like meat and smells like meat when you cook it, then it's not for vegetarians, right? And obviously we have a huge population of vegetarians in India who are protein deficient. So if we need to take a portfolio approach here, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. So, non-vegetarians are telling us that they want it to be juicy, fragrant, evocative of meat, and that's one segment. And then for veg protein, it's an entirely different segment with a set of goals. Siraj, you also hit upon a very interesting point there about research and development in that last answer. We've seen mostly the people who are entering this space in India are entrepreneurs who've been taking on this product development investment, right? So like you said, whether it's the utilization of ingredients that exist in India, pulses, millets, etc., of which we have a lot of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge, or it's replicating a particular end product like a meat or something like that, depending on which segment you're looking to target. There's a lot of work that we need to do, right? So even let's say a plant-based dairy needs to be creamy, versatile, etc., right? So what would you say from your experience in the big food ecosystem, not entrepreneurs, but the big food ecosystem, which we think is integral to driving the sector forward? What would you say is the appetite to take on product development and deep R&D investment for the space?
So I have been seeing a lot of interest in this. The way it is being done today is large companies investing in startups. So this is, I do not think that this will, I sort of divide companies in two. There are one which are actually working on managing their P&Ls and their results and their stakeholder expectations. There are other companies which are actually playing for the future, and which are getting capital because they have a story and a plan to change things down the line. And so this will be a relationship where there is science and technology funded by long-term capital and risk-willing capital, which will ultimately merge with the sort of enterprises that have the consumer connect. I am not very sure that large corporations will play this in-house for a very long time without seeing the results in a certain. They're answerable to their shareholders on a quarterly basis. So I would think that their appetite to play a 10-year game is going to be lesser than a startup which says that, okay, I'm putting this in for the next 10 years.
And, I should repeat, Siraj, that you sit on as an independent director on the board of many of these Indian companies. But, without Jubilant, Ingrevia, Tata Consumer Products, etc., who are giants reaching out to hundreds of millions of people, I should ask the question, and this might be a bit of an uncomfortable question, Siraj. So without, specifically focusing on any company, a lot of even the multinationals, a lot of the innovation centers for these companies are in places like Europe, increasingly moving to Singapore, they're in the US, etc. And, those innovation centers have made statements about investing in R&D. I mean, Nestle has partnered with a startup to look at cultivated meat, which you mentioned earlier. Cargill has made investments in cultivated meat, like you mentioned earlier. So, through a combination of investment and in-house R&D, people are looking at this space as an opportunity, right? So, do you think it's an inherent disadvantage for us in India and across the developing world that those innovation teams are not sitting in India at the moment? How do we get to a more, how do we transcend that pressure that you're talking about and think to that 10-year horizon in these large corporations in India?
See, my concern is the other thing that there is very little motivation. I mean, India is not a market for Western company looking at replacing meat here. I mean, today a large part of the global focus is essentially about replacing meat or reducing meat, which is where research and development is happening in the Western world. India is a different story. I mean, for us, it is a protein need. It is not a protein replacement. So our science and technology or our R&D has to be here because our ingredients are here, our cost bases are here, and whatever we produce have to fit in to the Indian culinary space, Indian pockets, as well as the diversity of Indian food. So the R&D has to be more in India than coming from the outside, because that thought process is very different. In fact, the opportunity I see is for India to create that and take it to the world.
Yeah, 100%. So we're with you with that, where we are with you on that 100%. And you mentioned that the ingredients are here.
Right.
Now, Siraj, you know better than anyone how building out an agri supply chain can be complex, especially in India. It can also be a politically complex or a sensitive issue, right? So you've mentioned just now about indigenous crops, pulses, millets, etc. We work with universities in India all the time where there is deep knowledge of all these crops: chickpeas, pigeon peas, millets, higher protein varietals, higher micronutrient varietals. And now we've started to stimulate some food science research with them as well, so we can get great next generation products, whether it's a snack bar or whether it's a meat replacement or whatever. But I think the piece that needs to be figured out is that upstream agri value chain piece and at huge scale. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to supply the needs of India, let alone the rest of the world. So, Siraj, my question to you is, as countries like Canada are making huge statements of intent and they're saying they want to be the protein farmers for the rest of the world, how do we get to that same level of ambition in India, and what is our implementation plan for something like that? Because that's something where entrepreneurs would be lost on how to integrate backwards into agri supply chains.
About 15, 20 years ago, I had this recommendation. I made this recommendation that if India is a protein deficit country and we are a surplus soybean meal producer, can the government incentivize the industry to we needed the soybean oil, but the meal that we were exporting, can that be transformed into texturized soya protein, which could actually be distributed through the public distribution system? And because that was, a product available to us, which was extremely protein rich, and there was a way to feed it into the population. And obviously, it didn't really materialize, but over a period of time, texturized soya protein has found more takers in India, and there are more brands and companies selling them and marketing them to the consumer. But the important part here is that we are actually still a country which focuses on calories. We are not focusing on nutrition. So we have stockpiles of paddy and wheat, which we keep producing more. So it is not very difficult for us to make that transition once there is a mechanism to use that produce. And if we have done it, if you look at India was a much bigger pulses deficit country 10 years ago or 7, 8 years ago, today we are pretty much self-sufficient. So which means that that jump has been made in increasing pulses production in the country. Today we are, from being an exporter of soybean meal, we've become an importer of soybean meal. But the opportunity to grow oilseed and use the produce or the oil, extract the oil and use the de-oiled extraction for converting into protein. These are all there. I mean, technologies have to be brought in. I think India has the opportunity to switch crops from carbohydrates to proteins. But there has to be a visible taker for it. I mean, and I think till the visible takers come in, this is probably a space where the government needs to step in more as a bridge to transition the crops from being carbohydrate driven to protein driven.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think your work in edible oil fortification at huge scale is also very relevant here, Siraj. So on that note of nutrition and really filling that protein gap, my last question for you is related to nutrition. You mentioned earlier that this can kind of walk a middle ground with undernutrition and overnutrition. So what would be your message or your action steps for, let's say, government folks in the audience or industry to come together to utilize this platform of smart proteins or plant proteins to really fill that protein gap over the next decade? Because that's really what we're talking about here, is huge human cost and opportunity unless we take action now over the next couple of years.
So I would say that, at a very radical suggestion would be that every time India has taken on something which with a mission mindset. So we had the green revolution, the Operation Flood, the yellow revolution, the blue revolution. So I think we need to get the government excited about a protein revolution. And that protein revolution would entail getting the government to encourage protein farming, protein here meaning pulses and the other crops that are high protein carrying crops, and creating a mechanism where the government procures and distributes. While that is happening, because this is, again, it is not going to happen with the switch of a button to say that, okay, farmer who's sowing wheat is going to suddenly switch to sowing pulses or something else. But if there is a roadmap for the, say, next 10 years, that these areas, we will set up procurement centers, farmers will be encouraged to switch, industry will be invited. And while the industry continues to fine tune its R&D, the government shifts the focus from carbohydrates to protein, and we will have a meeting point where the industry is ready with technology and the farmer is ready with the produce. And lo and behold, we could be 5, 7, 10 years down the line, a place to do business, because there are the takers and there are the givers.
So Raj, that's music to our ears, because we've been clamoring for a mission for smart protein for a couple of years now. And obviously, as we build back better from the pandemic, there can be no better person to encourage that mission orientation in India. We really, really appreciate your time joining us at the Smart
Protein pleasure.
Summit. And thank you so much. We're looking forward to working with you and making all of this a reality, by the way.
Certainly. Look forward to that. Thank you, Varun.
Thank you.